They gave my brother everything: cars, money, love, while I got nothing but silence. I was invisible in my own family, just existing in the background. I tried harder, achieved more, but it never mattered. Then my grandmother died, and everything changed. The will was read, and my name was the only one on it. Silence. Shock. Faces frozen. That was the moment they realized they lost everything. What would you do in my place? Comment below. Growing up, the difference between me and my brother wasn't subtle. It was constant, loud, and impossible to ignore. While Daniel was praised for the smallest things, I had to fight just to be seen. Every moment in our house revolved around him. His wins were celebrated like holidays. His failures were gently excused. And me? I learned to clap from the sidelines, smiling like it didn't hurt. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. But then the cracks started to show. Because it wasn't just attention, it was everything. When he turned 18, he got a brand new car, keys handed to him with pride. I got a quiet nod for my straight A's. That's when the tension really began to build. Because deep down, I wasn't jealous, I was confused. What did he have that I didn't? I worked harder. I stayed out of trouble. I followed every rule. Still, it was never enough. And the silence around it made it worse. No explanations. No apologies. Just this unspoken truth hanging in the air. Every time I got close to asking, something would stop me: a look, a sigh, a sudden change of subject. So I swallowed it. Again and again. Until one moment changed everything. I realized this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a phase. This was my place in the family. Not the daughter they were proud of, but the one they could overlook. And once that truth settled in, something inside me shifted quietly, painfully, permanently. And maybe that's where my story really begins. My name is Sophia Turner. I'm 27 years old. American. On paper, I had everything: a stable home, decent schools, a normal life. But that's the lie people see from the outside. Because inside that house, I was never really part of it. Not fully. Not equally. Not ever. And the strangest part? No one said it out loud. They didn't have to. You could feel it in the pauses, in the way my name was always second, or not mentioned at all. Daniel this. Daniel that. Always Daniel. And me? I became background noise. I learned early, too early, how to shrink myself just to fit into a space that never made room for me. I became the quiet one. The easy one. The one who doesn't cause trouble. Sounds good, right? No. It meant invisible. Completely invisible. I remember sitting at the dinner table, listening, waiting, hoping someone would ask me anything. They never did. And every time that silence stretched just a little longer, something inside me tightened. Then broke. Then hardened. Because here's the truth no one talks about. When you grow up ignored, you don't just feel sad, you start questioning your own worth. You start asking, am I the problem? I did. Over and over again. Until one day, I stopped asking. That was the shift. That was the dangerous part. Because I didn't heal. I adapted. I learned how to exist without love. Without validation. Without them. But what I didn't realize back then was that everything I was holding in, it wasn't disappearing. It was building. Quietly. Patiently. Waiting for the moment everything would finally break. And just when I thought I had learned how to live with it, something shifted. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But enough for me to feel it. Because in that house where I meant nothing, there was one person who saw everything. My grandmother. She didn't interrupt. She didn't confront anyone. But she watched. Closely. Every silence. Every unfair moment. Every time I disappeared in plain sight. And somehow, she understood. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was kind to everyone. Gentle. quiet, easy to overlook, just like me. But then the little things started to stand out. The way she asked about my day and actually listened. The way she remembered things no one else cared to notice. Small, right? Not really. Because in a house full of noise, she was the only one who heard me. And that's when the tension began to shift. Because what I saw as normal, she didn't. What I accepted, she questioned. But she never said it directly. Not yet. Instead, she stayed silent. Watching. Waiting. And that silence? It wasn't empty. It was building something. Something I didn't understand at the time. Something no one saw coming. Because while the rest of my family kept treating me like I didn't matter, my grandmother was already making a decision. A quiet one. A final one. And the truth is, by the time anyone realized what she had done, it was already too late to change anything. And that's what made everything even more unsettling, because from the outside, the Turner family looked perfect. Picture this. A beautiful suburban house, clean lawn, warm lights glowing through the windows every evening. The kind of home people slow down to admire. My parents were respected, successful, always smiling in public. Daniel? Charming, confident, the golden boy everyone loved. And me? I stood right beside them in photos, smiling just enough to complete the image. That was the illusion. And it worked. Neighbors praised us. Friends envied us. Even relatives said, "You're so lucky to have a family like that." Lucky. That word used to echo in my head. Because if this was lucky, why did it feel so empty? Inside those walls, everything was different. Conversations were selective. Attention was calculated. Love was conditional. You either earned it or you didn't get it. And somehow I was always just short. Dinner tables looked warm but felt cold. Laughter filled the room, but never reached me. Every moment was staged, controlled, polished for the outside world. And slowly I realized something chilling. We weren't a happy family. We were a performance. A perfectly rehearsed act where everyone knew their role. Daniel shined. My parents directed. And I disappeared. That was my role. Invisible, replaceable, unnecessary. And the scariest part? No one questioned it. Not even me. Not yet. Because when a lie is repeated long enough, it starts to feel like truth. But deep down, something was already cracking. And once that crack begins, it never really stops. And at the center of that perfect performance was Daniel. Not just my brother, but the golden child, the one everything revolved around. From the outside, it looked normal. Of course parents love their son, right? But this wasn't normal. This was something else. Something deeper. Something unfair in a way that no one ever said out loud. Every room he walked into became his stage. Every conversation somehow circled back to him. Every achievement, no matter how small, was amplified. A simple test score became a celebration. A casual compliment turned into a story repeated again and again. And me? I was there. Always there. Just not seen. At first, I tried to ignore it. Then I tried harder. Better grades. Better behavior. Less trouble. More effort. Nothing changed. That's when the tension really started to build. Because Daniel wasn't just loved, he was protected. Every mistake he made came with an excuse. He's under pressure. He didn't mean it. He'll do better next time. But when it was me, silence. No defense. No comfort. Just expectation. Cold and quiet. And that silence said everything. Daniel mattered more. That was the rule. Unspoken, but never broken. And over time, it changed him too. Slowly, he stopped asking and started expecting. Why wouldn't he? No one had ever told him no. I remember the moment it became undeniable. He crashed the family car. Completely his fault. And yet, a week later, he got a better one. No consequences. No lesson. Just reward. That was the shock. That was the truth. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This was a system. A system designed for him to win and for me to lose. And once I saw the pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. Because the difference between Daniel and me wasn't just emotional, it was practical, financial, undeniable. He was given everything. I had to build everything. When he needed money, he asked, and it appeared. No questions. No hesitation. When I needed something, I calculated, saved, sacrificed. That was my normal. At first, I told myself it made me stronger, more independent. That was my way of coping. But the truth kept pushing back. Because independence shouldn't come from neglect. It should be a choice, not something forced on you. And the gap kept widening. College? Fully paid for him. For me? You should apply for loans. A car? Gifted to him. I took buses. Walked. Worked extra shifts just to get by. And every time I struggled, I heard the same thing. That's life. But somehow, it was never his life. That was the tension. The unfairness that didn't even try to hide anymore. Then came the moment that hit hardest. I was working late, exhausted, trying to balance school and bills, when I saw Daniel posting photos from a luxury trip funded by my parents. Smiling. Relaxed. Carefree. And something inside me snapped. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Final. Because in that moment, I stopped comparing. I stopped hoping. I stopped believing things would ever change. That was the release. But here's the twist. Letting go didn't make me free, it made me invisible in a new way. Because once you stop asking for anything, people stop seeing you entirely. And that's when the real distance begins. And once that distance settled in, something inside me slowly began to change. Not all at once, never that simple. At first, it felt like control. Like I was protecting myself from disappointment. That was the build. Because if you expect nothing, nothing can hurt you, right? That's what I told myself. Over and over again. But the tension didn't disappear. It just went deeper. Every ignored moment didn't fade, it stacked. Every silence grew heavier. And instead of breaking, I adapted. That was the release. I became efficient at being alone. Independent. Unbothered, at least on the surface. I told myself I didn't need to be chosen. That I was fine being the one left out. But here's the truth I didn't want to admit. It wasn't strength. It was surrender. And that realization hit harder than anything before. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting for a place in my own family. I accepted it. Fully. Quietly. Permanently. That was the twist. I wasn't being overlooked anymore, I was allowing it. And the scariest part? No one noticed the difference. No one questioned it. Because for them, nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Because once you accept you're not chosen, you stop believing you ever will be. And that belief? It doesn't just stay in one place. It follows you. Into every room. Every relationship. Every decision. Until one day, you don't even recognize yourself anymore. And once I accepted that I wasn't chosen, the small things started to feel louder than ever. Not big moments. Not dramatic events. Just details. The kind people overlook. But those were the ones that cut the deepest. Birthdays, for example. Daniel's were unforgettable decorations, guests, expensive gifts, laughter filling every corner of the house. Mine? A quiet dinner. Sometimes just a cake. Once, they forgot entirely until the next day. They laughed it off. I didn't. That was the build. Then came the gifts. Christmas morning told the same story every year. Daniel unwrapped boxes, electronics, branded clothes, things he casually mentioned once. I opened smaller ones. Practical things. Safe choices. Nothing wrong, but never special. And I told myself it didn't matter. Until it did. That was the tension rising again. Because gifts aren't just objects, they're attention. And I could see exactly where that attention went. Then came something bigger. Tuition. Daniel's college was fully paid, no loans, no pressure. Just support. For me? You need to be responsible. That was the word they used. Responsible. As if I hadn't been my whole life. That was the breaking point. Not loud. Not explosive. Just final. Because in that moment, everything connected. The birthdays. The gifts. The money. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. A choice. Repeated again and again. That was the twist that hit hardest. They didn't forget me. They chose not to invest in me. And once that truth locked in, every small memory turned into proof. Every detail became evidence. And suddenly, my entire childhood didn't feel confusing anymore. It felt intentional. And once those patterns became impossible to ignore, something else started to hurt even more. My achievements didn't matter. Not really. Not in that house. At school, I was doing everything right. Top grades. Awards. Recognition from teachers who actually saw me. I remember the first time I got a major academic award. I held that paper like it was proof that I was finally enough. That was the build. I walked into the house, heart racing, waiting for a reaction. Waiting for something. But all I got was a quick glance. A nod. That's good. And then the conversation shifted back to Daniel. Always back to him. That was the tension snapping tighter. Because it didn't happen once. It happened every time. Every achievement I brought home was reduced to a moment, then erased. Meanwhile, Daniel could do something average, something basic, and it became a story repeated for weeks. That contrast? It wasn't subtle anymore. It was brutal. So I adjusted. That was the release. I stopped sharing. Stopped bringing things home. Stopped expecting them to care. I told myself I didn't need their validation. That I could be proud on my own. But here's the truth that hit harder than anything else. It still mattered. Their silence was louder than any praise. And then came the moment that changed everything. I overheard them talking. Not about me, about Daniel. Saying he was the one with real potential. That was the shock. Because suddenly, everything made sense. It didn't matter what I achieved. In their eyes, I had already been decided. And no matter how high I climbed, I would never reach him. And if my achievements were invisible, Daniel's failures were somehow untouchable. That's what made it worse. Because it wasn't just that he was favored when he succeeded, he was protected when he failed. I started noticing it more clearly after that conversation. Every mistake he made was softened, explained away, almost erased. That was the build. He missed deadlines, and suddenly he was under pressure. He lost opportunities, and it became a learning experience. Nothing ever stuck to him. Nothing ever followed him. That's when the tension really started to spike. Because I had seen what happened when I made even the smallest mistake. Silence. Disappointment. Distance. But with him, there was always a safety net. Always someone stepping in before he could fall too hard. Then came the moment that sealed it. He failed a major exam, one that actually mattered. I remember the atmosphere in the house shifting, but not in the way I expected. No anger. No consequences. Just concern. Support. Reassurance. My parents sat with him, told him it was okay, that he would bounce back. That was the release. Gentle. Protective. Almost comforting. And then came the shock. Because a week later, they rewarded him with something even bigger than before. As if failure deserved compensation. As if falling down meant you should be lifted higher. That was the twist I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't about fairness. It was about favoritism, reinforced at every level. And in that system, Daniel could never truly fail, because someone would always catch him. And after watching it happen over and over again, there came a moment I couldn't ignore anymore. Not a big scene. Not an argument. Just clarity. Quiet, sharp, undeniable. It happened one evening at the dinner table. Nothing special at first. Normal conversation. Daniel talking. My parents listening. Laughing. Engaged. I was there too, physically, but not really part of it. That was the build. Then I tried to speak. Just a small comment. Something simple. And suddenly, silence. Not full silence, but that shift. That pause. The kind that tells you you've interrupted something more important. The tension hit instantly. My words faded before they even landed. No one responded. No one followed up. The conversation moved on like I hadn't said anything at all. And that's when it happened. The realization. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just cold. Clear. Final. That was the release. Because in that exact moment, I saw it for what it really was. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't unconscious. This was a choice. Repeated. Reinforced. Accepted by everyone in that room. Then came the shock. Because instead of feeling angry, I felt nothing. No reaction. No fight left. Just emptiness. And that emptiness? It was louder than anything I had ever felt before. That was the twist. I didn't need more proof. I didn't need more moments. That single second confirmed everything. I wasn't overlooked. I was excluded. And once you see that truth clearly, there's no going back. And maybe that's why I almost missed the one person who never treated me like I was invisible. Because while I was busy accepting my place in the family, she had already seen the truth. My grandmother. At first, she didn't stand out. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand attention. In a house full of strong personalities, she was easy to overlook. Just like me. That was the build. But then, little moments started to shift everything. She would ask me simple questions. How was your day? But unlike everyone else, she waited for the answer. Really waited. That was the tension. Because I wasn't used to being heard. Not like that. At first, I didn't know how to respond. I kept my answers short. Safe. But she didn't stop. She remembered details. Followed up days later. Not because she had to, but because she cared. That was the release. Subtle, but powerful. And slowly, something inside me softened. But here's where it changed. Because one day, she said something that stayed with me. You know, I've been watching for a long time. That was the moment. The shift. The warning I didn't understand yet. Because in her voice, there wasn't just kindness. There was awareness. And maybe even disappointment. Not in me, but in everything around me. That was the twist. She wasn't just noticing me. She was noticing everything. Every silence. Every imbalance. Every moment I disappeared. And suddenly, I realized something that made my chest tighten. I wasn't alone in this anymore. Someone else had seen it too. And unlike me, she hadn't accepted it. And once I realized she truly saw me, something shifted in the way we spoke to each other. At first, our conversations were simple. Small talk. Safe topics. But slowly they deepened. She started asking questions no one else ever asked. Are you happy? Do you feel heard? Questions that lingered longer than I expected. That was the build. Because I didn't have answers. Not real ones. I hesitated. Deflected. Changed the subject. But she didn't let it go. That was the tension. Not forceful, but persistent. She would sit with me, quiet, patient, waiting for something real. And eventually, I started opening up. Little by little. I told her things I had never said out loud. About the silence, the distance, the feeling of never being enough. That was the release. And instead of dismissing it, she listened. Fully. No interruptions. No corrections. Just understanding. But then came the moment that changed everything. She looked at me and said, "You've been taught to accept less than you deserve." That hit harder than anything before. That was the shock. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about my family, it was about me. About what I had allowed. What I had normalized. That was the twist. She wasn't just comforting me. She was challenging me. And for the first time, I felt something dangerous. Not pain, not sadness, but clarity. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that forces you to see everything differently. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. And once that clarity settled in, something even more unexpected began to surface. She didn't just understand me, she believed in me. Not in a vague, comforting way, but in a way that felt precise, intentional, almost unsettling. That was the build. Because no one had ever looked at me like that before. Not with certainty. Not with conviction. She would point out things I had never even noticed about myself. You think deeper than most people. You notice what others ignore. At first, I brushed it off. It felt unfamiliar. Uncomfortable. That was the tension. Because when you grow up being overlooked, being seen can feel almost wrong. Like you don't deserve it. But she didn't stop. She kept naming things. Strengths I had buried. Qualities I had minimized. And slowly, something shifted. Dismissed. Not by accident, but by choice. And once that truth settled in, it didn't just change how I saw my family. It changed how I saw myself. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to prove I was enough. I was starting to realize. I always had been. And just when I started to see myself differently, I began to notice something even deeper about her. She wasn't just encouraging me, she knew exactly what was happening in this family. That was the build. It showed in the way she watched everyone at the table, in the pauses she held just a second longer than necessary, in the way her eyes followed moments others ignored. At first, I thought I was imagining it. That maybe I was projecting my own feelings onto her. That was the tension. Because part of me still wanted to believe this was all accidental. Unintentional. But then, little comments started slipping through. Quiet. Precise. Some people are given more chances than they earn. Or, not everyone here is being seen equally. She never said names. She didn't have to. That was the release. Because every word landed exactly where it needed to. And I felt it. Deep. Unavoidable. But then came the moment that changed everything. She looked at me, really looked, and said, "I notice who gets chosen, and who doesn't." That was the shock. No softness. No hiding. Just truth. That was the twist. Because in that second, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just my experience. It wasn't just in my head. She had seen it all along. Every imbalance. Every unfair moment. Every time I was left behind. And unlike me, she hadn't normalized it. She hadn't accepted it. Which meant one thing. This story wasn't over yet. Not even close. And maybe that's why, when everything finally started to fall apart, I knew it wasn't random. It felt inevitable. That was the build. Because for the first time in my life, the problem wasn't inside my family, it was outside. My job. The one thing I had built completely on my own. No help. No shortcuts. Just long hours and quiet persistence. I wasn't the best, but I was reliable. Consistent. The kind of employee no one worries about. Until one day, everything changed. The company announced sudden cuts. Budget issues. Restructuring. Words that sound distant until they land on you. That was the tension. Meetings turned cold. Emails became vague. And then came mine. A short message. Formal. Final. My position was eliminated. Not performance. Not mistakes. Just gone. That was the release. Quick. Clean. Impersonal. And somehow that made it worse. Because there was nothing to fight. Nothing to fix. I packed my things in silence, watching others avoid eye contact as if loss was contagious. But the real shock came later. Sitting alone, holding that final paycheck, I realized something that made everything heavier. This wasn't like before. This time, I had no safety net. No backup. No one waiting to catch me. That was the twist. Because Daniel would never face this alone. He never had to. But me? This was different. Completely. And as that reality settled in, one thought kept repeating, louder each second. If I fall now, there's no one coming to help me. And for the first time, that truth didn't just hurt. It terrified me. And that fear, it pushed me to do something I never thought I would do again. I went back. Back to the house I had emotionally left long ago. That was the build. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. I told myself this was temporary. Just practical. Just survival. Nothing more. But even as I stood in front of that door, something felt wrong. Familiar, but heavy. That was the tension. Because deep down, I already knew what I was walking into. Still, I knocked. And when the door opened, everything looked the same. The house. The smell. The silence. Like nothing had changed. That was the release. For a second, I almost felt relief. Like maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I sat down, explained what happened. Calm. Clear. Careful not to sound desperate. I didn't ask for much. Just time. Just a little support to get back on my feet. And then, it happened. That shift. That look between them. The pause before the response. That was the shock. Because I had seen it before. Too many times. And suddenly, I wasn't a daughter asking for help, I was a problem they had to deal with. That was the twist. Everything I had built on my own meant nothing in that moment. And as their silence stretched just a little too long, one truth hit harder than anything else. I hadn't come home. I had walked straight back into the same place that never chose me. And then, just as I was holding on to that last bit of hope, they answered. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just cold. That was the build. My father spoke first, his tone calm, almost detached. You need to figure this out on your own. No emotion. No hesitation. Just a statement. Final. My mother didn't interrupt. She didn't soften it. She just nodded, like it made perfect sense. That was the tension tightening instantly. Because I wasn't asking for everything. I wasn't asking to stay forever. Just a little time. A small safety net. Something. But what I got instead was distance. Measured. Intentional. We've already done enough, my mother added. Enough. That word hit harder than anything else. That was the release, if you could even call it that. Because in that moment, something inside me stopped reaching. Stopped expecting. Completely. And then came the shock. Because right after that, the conversation shifted. Not to me. Not to my situation. But to Daniel. His plans. His future. As if I wasn't sitting right there, still trying to process what had just happened. That was the twist. I wasn't just rejected, I was dismissed. Erased in real time. And suddenly, everything became painfully clear. This wasn't about circumstances. It wasn't about timing. It was about me. About where I stood in their lives. And as I sat there, listening to them move on without me, one truth settled in deeper than ever before. I hadn't come back for help. I had come back to be reminded exactly why I left. And just when I thought that moment couldn't get any colder, it did. Because only a few days later, Something happened that erased any doubt I had left. That was the build. I was still trying to process everything, still replaying their words in my head, still figuring out my next step, when I saw it. A brand new car in the driveway. Shiny. Expensive. Impossible to miss. At first, I thought it belonged to someone else. It had to. That was the tension creeping in. But then Daniel walked out, smiling, keys in his hand, completely at ease. And, just like that, everything clicked. My parents followed behind him, proud, excited, talking about features, upgrades, plans. As if nothing else in the world existed. That was the release, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like confirmation. Because just days after telling me they had done enough, they had done more. Just not for me. And then came the shock. I stood there unnoticed, watching them celebrate him again, while I was still trying to survive. No hesitation. No guilt. No awareness. That was the twist that hit the hardest. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about choice. About who they decided to invest in, and who they didn't. And in that moment, the contrast became unbearable. I wasn't just unsupported, I was excluded by design. And as I turned away, one thought burned louder than anything else. I hadn't lost my job. I had just lost the illusion that this family would ever choose me. And that was the moment something inside me finally broke, completely. Not cracked. Not shaken. Broken. That was the build. Because up until then, a small part of me still hoped. Still believed that maybe, somehow, they would see me. Choose me. Just once. But standing there, watching them celebrate him while I stood invisible again, that hope didn't fade. It collapsed. That was the tension snapping all at once. Every memory, every silence, every unfair moment rushed back, louder than ever. And suddenly, it all connected. Not pieces. A pattern. Clear. Unavoidable. That was the release. Because for the first time, I stopped trying to justify it. Stopped making excuses for them. Stopped blaming myself. And then came the shock that changed everything. I didn't feel sad anymore. I didn't feel angry either. I felt nothing. Empty. Completely empty. That was the twist. Because the pain I carried for years didn't explode, it disappeared. And in its place was something colder. Something sharper. Clarity. The kind that doesn't hurt, but cuts everything away. And in that clarity, one truth stood alone. I was never part of their plan. Never the one they would invest in. Never the one they would choose. And once that truth locked in, it didn't just end something, it started something new. Because if they were never going to show up for me, then I had to stop showing up for them. Completely. Permanently. No more waiting. No more hoping. No more pretending. That illusion was gone. And it wasn't coming back. And once that illusion was gone, there was nothing left to hold me there. No reason to stay. No reason to keep pretending. That was the build. Because for the first time, the decision didn't feel emotional, it felt clear. Cold. Final. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't try to make them understand. That part of me was already gone. That was the tension shifting into something sharper. Instead, I walked to my room, looked around at everything that once felt like home, and realized none of it belonged to me. Not really. Not anymore. That was the release. I packed slowly, like I wasn't leaving something behind, I was letting it go. And then came the moment. The door. The last step. That was the shock. Because no one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. No one even noticed. That silence? It said everything. That was the twist that sealed it. I hadn't just decided to leave. I had already been gone in their eyes. And as I stepped outside, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel scared. I felt free. Not because everything was okay, but because for the first time, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was choosing myself. And once that decision was made, there was no going back. Not this time. Not ever. And the moment I chose myself, reality hit harder than anything before. Freedom wasn't easy. It wasn't peaceful. It was brutal. That was the build. Because suddenly, every safety net was gone. No home to fall back on. No one to call. Just me, and everything I had to figure out alone. I took the first job I could get. Then another. And another. Days blurred into nights. Mornings started before sunrise, and most nights ended with me too exhausted to even think. That was the tension rising fast. I wasn't living, I was surviving. Every dollar mattered. Every meal was calculated. Rent, bills, transport, it never stopped. And no matter how hard I worked, it always felt like I was one step behind. That was the pressure closing in. But I didn't quit. I couldn't. That was the release, if you could call it that. Because pushing forward became automatic. No emotions. Just motion. Work. Sleep. Repeat. Until one moment broke through everything. I remember standing in a small, dim apartment, counting the last cash I had, and realizing it still wasn't enough. That was the shock. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet panic. The kind that sits in your chest and doesn't leave. And then came the twist. Because in that exact moment, when everything felt like it was collapsing, I didn't think about going back. Not once. Not even as an option. That's when I knew something had changed permanently. This wasn't just struggle anymore. This was transformation. Painful. Relentless. But real. Because for the first time in my life, everything I had came from me. And no one could take that away. And in the middle of all that struggle, something else became impossible to ignore. The silence. That was the build. Not a message. Not a call. Not even a simple, "Are you okay?" Days passed. Then weeks. And nothing came. At first, I told myself they were busy. That maybe they didn't know how to reach out. That was the tension creeping in because deep down I knew better. They knew exactly how to find me. They just didn't. And the longer that silence stretched, the heavier it became. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. A quiet reminder that I was no longer part of their world. That was the release. Because eventually, I stopped checking my phone. Stopped wondering. Stopped hoping. I adapted like I always did. But then came the moment that hit harder than expected. I saw a photo online. My family together. Smiling. Celebrating something I didn't even know what. And I wasn't there. No mention. No absence noticed. That was the shock. Because it wasn't just silence anymore, it was replacement. Life had moved on without me seamlessly. That was the twist that cut the deepest. I hadn't just left. I had been erased. And as I stared at that image, one truth settled in with brutal clarity. I wasn't missed. Not even a little. And somehow, that hurt more than anything they had ever said. And yet, in the middle of that silence, one voice never disappeared. Hers. That was the build. My grandmother didn't call often, but she called. Short conversations. Simple questions. Did you eat? Are you sleeping enough? Nothing dramatic. But real. That was the tension. Because every time I saw her name on my phone, something in my chest tightened. Not from fear, but from relief. She was the only connection that hadn't been cut. The only proof I hadn't been completely erased. And slowly, those calls became something more. That was the release. I started opening up again. Telling her about the jobs, the exhaustion, the nights I didn't know how I would make it through. And she listened like always. Steady. Unshaken. But then came the moment that shifted everything. One evening, after a long pause, she said quietly, "I wish things had been different for you." That was the shock. Because it wasn't comfort. It wasn't encouragement. It was acknowledgement. Raw. Honest. Final. And then came the twist. Because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't just checking on me. She was carrying the weight of everything she had seen and never said. Every silence. Every unfair moment. Every choice they made. And suddenly, her calls felt heavier. Not in a bad way, but in a real way. Because she wasn't just the only one who stayed. She was the only one who knew the truth. And maybe, the only one who was waiting for the right moment to do something about it. And maybe that's why, when the call finally came, I knew something was wrong before I even answered. That was the build. It was late. Too late for a normal call. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize, but something in me already tightened. I picked up, heart pounding, not ready, but somehow expecting it. That was the tension rising instantly. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. Is this Sophia? A pause. Then the words came, slow and careful. I'm calling about your grandmother, and in that moment, everything inside me went still. That was the release, but not relief. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. I didn't need to hear the rest. I already knew. But they said it anyway. She was gone. Just like that. No warning. No goodbye. That was the shock. Because out of everything I had prepared myself for, this was the one thing I never thought would happen so soon. The only person who stayed. The only one who saw me. Gone. And then came the twist that hurt the most. My first instinct wasn't to cry. It wasn't to call anyone. It was emptiness. Pure, hollow silence. Because in that moment, it didn't just feel like I lost her. It felt like I lost the last connection to something real. And as the call ended, one thought echoed louder than anything else. Now, there was truly no one left. And yet, despite everything, I went back. Not because I wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go for this. That was the build. The drive felt longer than it should have. Every mile heavier than the last. My hands stayed tight on the wheel, my thoughts louder than the road. Memories kept flashing her voice, her words, the way she saw me. And then, the house appeared. That was the tension rising again. Same walls. Same driveway. Nothing had changed. But everything felt different. I sat there for a moment, engines still running, heart refusing to settle. Because I knew the second I stepped out, I wasn't just coming back for her. I was walking back into them. That was the weight of it. I finally opened the door, stepped out, and the air felt colder than I remembered. Familiar, but distant. That was the release, but not comfort. Just acceptance. I walked inside, slow, quiet, almost like I didn't belong there anymore. And maybe I didn't. Then came the shock. No one rushed to me. No one asked if I was okay. Just brief looks. Nods. As if I were a guest, not family. That was the twist. Even here, even now, nothing had shifted. Not grief. Not loss. Not reality. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who were supposed to be mine, one truth pressed down harder than anything else. I didn't come home to feel closer. I came back to realize just how far away I had always been. And it didn't take long to realize why everyone was really there. That was the build. At first, it looked like grief. Quiet conversations. Low voices. People gathering in small groups, nodding, whispering. But if you listened closely, really listened, you could hear it. Not sadness. Not loss. Something else. Numbers. Properties. What happens next? That was the tension rising fast. Because the focus wasn't on her, it was on what she left behind. I stood there, waiting for someone to say her name with meaning, to remember something real about her. But instead, I heard discussions about the house, the savings, the legal process. As if her life had already been reduced to assets. That was the release, but it felt hollow. Because suddenly, everything made sense in the worst possible way. This wasn't a family mourning. This was a room full of people calculating. And then came the shock. I overheard my parents speaking quietly, thinking no one was paying attention. It should stay in the family, my father said. We'll figure out how to divide it, my mother replied. Divide. That word echoed louder than anything else. That was the twist that hit the hardest. Because they weren't asking what she wanted. They were assuming, claiming, planning before anything was even known. And in that moment, something inside me went cold again. This wasn't just about loss. It was about entitlement. About who they believed deserved what. And as I stood there, invisible once more, one truth settled in with brutal clarity. They hadn't come to say goodbye. They had come to collect. And the longer I stayed in that room, the clearer it became. Everyone already believed they knew how this would end. That was the build. No official reading yet. No documents. No confirmation. But it didn't matter. In their minds, it was already decided. I watched the way they spoke, casual, confident, almost certain. My parents acted like it was just a matter of time. Daniel didn't even question it. That was the tension tightening fast. Because no one asked what she wanted. No one wondered if there was anything unexpected. They assumed. Completely. As if the outcome belonged to them by default. I heard phrases like, when we get the house and we'll handle the accounts. Not if. When. That word repeated again and again. That was the release, but it felt wrong. Too easy. Too rehearsed. Like a script they had already memorized. And then came the moment that made everything sharper. Someone joked lightly, of course it stays in the family. Laughter followed. Agreement. That was the shock. Because no one noticed the irony. No one questioned what family even meant anymore. That was the twist. They believed they were entitled without ever being chosen. And as I stood there, listening to their certainty grow stronger, one thought settled quietly in my mind. They were all waiting for something they believed was already theirs, without realizing the one person who made that decision had seen everything. And then, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. That was the build. The room shifted the second the lawyer walked in. Conversations stopped. Movements slowed. Even the air felt heavier, like something was about to break. We all took our seats, but no one relaxed. Eyes locked forward. Hands still. Waiting. That was the tension tightening with every second. The lawyer opened the folder, calm, precise, completely unaffected by the storm building in that room. Papers shuffled. A small sound, but it echoed louder than it should have. Then he began to read. Formal words. Legal language. Slow. Measured. And yet, every sentence felt like it carried weight far beyond the paper. That was the release, but not relief. Just a deeper silence. Because no one interrupted. No one moved. They were listening, but more than that, they were anticipating. Waiting for the part that mattered. The part they already believed they knew. And then came the pause. A brief one. But enough. That was the shock. Because in that silence, something shifted. You could feel it. The certainty in the room started to crack, just slightly. Just enough to make everyone uneasy. That was the twist beginning to unfold. Because for the first time, doubt entered the room. Quiet. Subtle. Dangerous. And as the lawyer looked down at the next line, one truth settled in, heavy and unavoidable. This wasn't going to go the way they expected. Not even close. And then, he read my name. That was the build, but it didn't feel real at first. Just a sound. Familiar, yet completely out of place in that moment. Sophia Turner. The room didn't react immediately. Neither did I. It took a second for it to land. for the meaning to catch up with the words. That was the tension tightening in silence. Because he didn't stop. He kept reading, detailing assets, the house, the accounts, everything. And each line pointed to the same thing. Me. That was the release, but it came with disbelief. I felt every pair of eyes shift, slowly, sharply, toward me. Confusion first, then doubt, then something darker. And then came the shock. My father moved slightly, like he hadn't heard correctly. My mother's face froze. Daniel let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. That's not right. But the lawyer didn't react. He simply continued. Calm. Certain. Final. That was the twist hitting all at once. Because this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't partial. This was everything. Clearly stated. Legally binding. Undeniable. The certainty they carried into that room collapsed in seconds. And in its place came something raw. Anger. Panic. Realization. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. Because in that moment, something deeper settled in. This wasn't just about inheritance. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about choice. Her choice. Final. Deliberate. And as the room filled with rising voices and breaking control, one truth stood stronger than all of it. For the first time in my life, I had been chosen. And the moment that truth settled in, everything around me started to fracture. That was the build. The silence didn't last. It couldn't. My father was the first to react, his voice sharp, controlled, but cracking underneath. This doesn't make sense. My mother followed immediately, shaking her head, her expression tight with disbelief. There has to be a mistake. That was the tension rising fast, thick, suffocating. Because this wasn't how their story was supposed to go. Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing once, then turning back with a forced laugh that didn't hide anything. No, this is wrong. She wouldn't do that. Wouldn't. Not couldn't. That word hung heavy. That was the release, but it wasn't calm. It was denial spilling out in real time. They weren't processing, they were rejecting. Every glance toward me now carried something different. Not indifference. Not distance. But accusation. As if I had done something. Taken something. And then came the shock. My father stepped closer to the lawyer, demanding clarification, his tone no longer calm. Read that again. My mother crossed her arms, already defensive, already preparing to fight something that hadn't even changed. Daniel just stared at me, eyes narrowed, searching for an answer I didn't have to give. That was the twist hitting hardest. Because in that moment, I realized something brutal. They didn't question the will, they questioned me. My presence. My worth. My right to be chosen. And as their voices grew louder, sharper, more desperate, one truth cut through everything. This wasn't about losing something they expected. This was about facing a reality they had never prepared for, that I was never who they thought I was. And just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, the lawyer continued. That was the build. His voice didn't change. Calm. Precise. Unmoved by the chaos starting to rise in the room. He turned the page, adjusted his glasses slightly, and kept reading. That was the tension tightening again. Because whatever came next, no one was ready for it. All remaining assets. He began, and the room froze all over again. Every movement stopped. Every breath held. And then the words landed. Are to be transferred in full to Sophia Turner. That was the release, but it didn't bring relief. It detonated. Completely. You could feel it. The shift. The collapse. No division. No shared control. No conditions. Everything. Entirely. Mine. And then came the shock. My mother's face drained of color. My father stepped back like he had physically been hit. Daniel didn't speak this time. He just stared, silent, processing something he had never even imagined. That was the twist that shattered everything. Because this wasn't partial. This wasn't symbolic. This was absolute. Every assumption they carried, erased in a single sentence. And in that moment, the room didn't just feel tense, it felt unstable. Like reality itself had tilted. And as their certainty turned into disbelief, then anger, then something dangerously close to desperation, one truth stood unshaken. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was her final decision. Clear, complete, irreversible. And for the first time, there was nothing they could do to change it. And just when the room felt like it couldn't hold any more tension, the lawyer reached for one final document. That was the build. A letter. Folded carefully. Separate from everything else. He hesitated for a brief second, then looked directly at me. This was left specifically for you. The room shifted again. Quieter. Sharper. That was the tension pulling tight. Because suddenly, this wasn't about assets anymore. This was personal. I took the letter slowly, my hands steady, but something inside me wasn't. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Like it carried more than just words. That was the release beginning to unfold. I opened it, eyes scanning the familiar handwriting I hadn't realized I would miss this much. And then I read. Her voice was there. Clear. Gentle. Unshaken. She didn't talk about money. She didn't explain the assets. She talked about me. About what she had seen. I watched you be overlooked, and still remain kind. My chest tightened. Line after line, she named every moment I thought no one noticed. Every silence. Every time I chose to endure instead of break. And then came the shock. This is not a reward. This is a correction. I stopped breathing for a second. That sentence cut through everything. That was the twist. Because suddenly, it wasn't about inheritance. It was about truth. About balance. About restoring something that had been denied for too long. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who still didn't understand, one realization settled in deeper than anything else. She hadn't just given me everything. She had finally given me what no one else ever did, recognition. And as I kept reading, the truth in her words only went deeper. That was the build. She didn't soften it. She didn't hide behind polite language. Line by line, she named what no one else ever dared to admit. I saw the difference in how you were treated. My fingers tightened around the paper. Because this wasn't assumption. This wasn't guesswork. She knew. That was the tension rising again. Every sentence peeled back another layer. I watched your silence grow, while others were given a voice. My throat tightened. The room around me faded. It was just me and her words now. That was the release, but it came with weight. Because for the first time, everything I had felt was being validated. Fully. Clearly. Without doubt. And then came the moment that hit hardest. What was taken from you was not small. It was years of being unseen. That was the shock. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about moments anymore. It was about time. About everything I had lost without even realizing it. And then came the twist that changed everything. I could not stop it then, but I can correct it now. My breath caught. Because in that sentence, there was something more than regret. There was intention. Action. Choice. She hadn't just witnessed the unfairness, she had decided to answer it. And as her words settled into me, one truth became impossible to ignore. I hadn't imagined any of it. I hadn't exaggerated it. The injustice was real, and she had seen it all along. And as her words continued, the reason behind everything began to take shape, clearer, sharper, undeniable. That was the build. She didn't change the will on impulse. She didn't act out of emotion alone. Every line revealed intention. Thought. Time. I have watched long enough, she wrote. And that sentence alone carried weight. Because it meant this wasn't sudden. This was built over years. That was the tension tightening again. Every moment she had witnessed, every imbalance she had stayed silent about, had been leading here. Fairness was never given to you, so I chose to give it myself. My breath slowed as I read that line. That was the release, but it wasn't gentle. It was heavy, final. Because this wasn't about favoring me. It was about correcting something that had been wrong for too long. And then came the shock. Love is not proven by words, but by what we are willing to do when it matters. That sentence cut deeper than anything else. Because suddenly, everything my parents had said over the years felt empty. That was the twist. She wasn't just explaining her decision, she was redefining what family meant. Not blood, not expectation, but action. Choice. And as the last line settled in, one truth stood stronger than everything else in that room. She didn't leave me everything because I needed it more. She left it to me because, in her eyes, I was the only one who had truly earned it. And as the final lines of her letter settled into me, something shifted in a way I had never felt before. That was the build. Not loud, not overwhelming, just undeniable. For so long, I had lived in the space of not being chosen, not being seen, not being enough. It had shaped everything, how I spoke, how I stayed silent, how I learned to expect less. That was the tension rising again. Because even now, standing there with everything in my hands, a part of me still hesitated, still questioned, still wondered if this could somehow be taken away, if this moment would disappear like all the others. But it didn't. That was the release. The letter didn't change. The decision didn't shift. The truth stayed exactly where it was. Solid. Unmovable. And then it hit me. Fully. Completely. That was the shock. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't fragile. This was real. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to prove anything to earn it. That was the twist that changed everything. Because I wasn't being compared. I wasn't being measured. I wasn't being overlooked. I was being chosen. Intentionally. Without condition. Without hesitation. And that realization didn't just fill a gap, it rewrote something deeper. Years of doubt, of silence, of being pushed aside, all collided with this single truth. And as it settled in, one feeling rose above everything else. Not pride, not relief, but something stronger, something steadier. Worth. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to fight for a place. I finally had one. And almost immediately after that realization settled in, everything shifted again. That was the build. The same people who had ignored me, dismissed me, erased me, suddenly turned toward me. Not with anger this time, but with something else. Something softer. Careful. My mother was the first to step forward, her voice lower than I had ever heard it. Sophia, we didn't know. That was the tension rising again. Because those words felt wrong the moment they left her mouth. My father followed, clearing his throat, trying to sound steady. Maybe we made some mistakes. Mistakes. The word echoed, too small for everything it carried. That was the release, but it wasn't relief. It was discomfort. Because now they were reaching out. Now they were trying. And then came the shift. Daniel, who had always stood above it all, looked at me differently. Less certain. Less untouchable. We can fix this, he said quietly. Fix. That word hit hard. That was the shock. Because suddenly, they weren't denying anymore. They were negotiating. Reframing. Rewriting the past in real time. That was the twist. Their change didn't come from understanding. It came from consequence. From loss. From realizing they were no longer in control. And as they stood there, offering apologies that came too late, one truth settled in deeper than ever before. They didn't see me when I had nothing. They saw me now because I had everything. And hearing those words, Something inside me didn't move the way they expected. That was the build. No anger. No outburst. Just stillness. The kind that comes after everything has already been felt and burned out. I looked at them, really looked, and for the first time, I wasn't searching for approval. That was the shift. The tension didn't rise in me anymore. It settled. Quiet. Controlled. Final. You didn't know? I repeated softly, not as a question, but as a realization. Because deep down, they had always known. They just chose not to act. That was the release. Not forgiveness. Not rejection. Just truth, spoken without emotion. And then came the moment they didn't see coming. I shook my head. Slightly. Enough. It's too late. That was the shock. The words landed heavier than anything else in the room. No raised voice. No anger. Just certainty. That was the twist. Because they expected resistance. Pain. Maybe even negotiation. But not this. Not calm refusal. Not distance that couldn't be crossed. My mother tried to step closer. My father opened his mouth again. Daniel looked like he wanted to argue. But I didn't give them space. Not this time. I needed you when I had nothing, I said, steady, clear. And you weren't there. Silence followed. Real silence. And in that silence, everything ended. That was the payoff. Because this wasn't revenge. This wasn't punishment. This was closure. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need their presence. I didn't need them anymore. And for the first time, that truth didn't hurt. It set me free. And as that silence settled, something even deeper became clear. That was the build. For so long, I had measured my worth through their eyes. Through what they gave, what they withheld, what they chose to see or ignore. Every moment of doubt, every time I felt less than, came from that single place. That was the tension I had carried for years. Because when the people who are supposed to love you the most don't choose you, you start believing there must be something wrong with you. But standing there, no longer needing anything from them, something shifted completely. That was the release. I saw it for what it truly was. Their choices were never a reflection of my value. Only a reflection of their limits. Their blindness. Their decisions. And then came the shock that changed everything. I had spent years trying to earn something that was never theirs to give. That was the twist. Because worth isn't assigned by family. It isn't proven through approval. It isn't validated by being chosen by the wrong people. It exists, whether anyone recognizes it or not. And once that truth locked in, everything else lost its power. Their silence. Their rejection. Even their late apologies. None of it defined me anymore. And as I walked away, one message stayed with me, stronger than anything else. You don't become valuable when someone finally sees you. You were always valuable, they just failed to notice. And as I walked away from that house, I realized something that changed everything. That was the build. For so long, I thought revenge meant proving them wrong. Showing them what they lost. Making them regret every moment they overlooked me. That belief stayed with me for years, quietly shaping every step I took. That was the tension. Because even after everything, a part of me still wanted them to see. To finally understand. But then, something shifted. That was the release. I didn't need their regret. I didn't need their realization. I didn't need anything from them at all. And that's when it hit me. Fully. Clearly. That was the shock. The greatest revenge isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't beg for attention. That was the twist. The greatest revenge is living well without them. Building a life they're no longer part of. Becoming someone who no longer waits to be chosen. And in that truth, everything changed. Their absence stopped being a wound and became freedom. Their silence stopped hurting and started healing. And as I kept moving forward, one thing became undeniable. I didn't lose them. I outgrew them. Completely. And if you've ever felt unseen, overlooked, or never chosen, let me ask you this. What would your life look like if you stopped waiting for them to? Tell me in the comments.